Okay, so today we're going to continue our study of Hosea, and the thing that we all have to remember, and I know you all know this, but we must remember that the entire book is made up of metaphors about Hosea's marriage to Gomer, how it's like Israel's relationship to God, and it's about how Israel abandoned God in every way possible, and he speaks of this in metaphors. Uh, Israel didn't worship God. They worshiped the gods of the people that God told the Israelites to rid the country of. They didn't do what he said when they came into the nation. They made political agreements with other nations to fight wars with them or for them. Now, over the years, many sermons have been given using Hosea or this book as a template for divorce and remarriage. I'm not going in that direction today. I've tried to make this study purely about the metaphors in chapter 2. And to help me, I've taken a lot of stuff from commentaries and I've paraphrased some of it. So I don't want you to accuse me of plagiarism. Because and I do this every week. I read a lot of commentaries, and I never know whether something's my words or out of a uh, one of the commentaries. So here we go. Now remember, I try to put the map and the timeline that Mark found and gave us a long time ago. But this is the northern part of Israel right here. The green is what's known as Israel, and the orange, of course, I don't know what color your computers have on it, but I'm green and orange here. So here's the timeline. That's the whole timeline. And I need to get something out of my way. And here's the shortened timeline, which is the time that Hosea is speaking. You can see he started speaking at the tail end of Jeroboam II and went all the way to almost through Hosea. And I think I told you all last week that the Hebrew words for Hosea and Hosea are both the same, but the translators showed a difference. Why they did it, I don't know. Don't care. Okay, so I want to show a little bit from chapter 1 to lead us into chapter 2. And this is about all I'm going to say about Gomer. Maybe once or twice more, but God told Hosea to take a wife of harlotry, and we went through most of that last week. But she bore him a son, and this is what I want to emphasize is the names. She named him the firstborn Jezreel for a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel. You might remember from a few months ago when we studied about Jehu, and this is from the Bible Knowledge Commentary. The reason for Yahweh's coming punishment on Jehu's dynasty was the massacre at Jezreel. Jehu's daughter, I'm sorry, Jehu's slaughter of Jezebel and Ahab's descendants had been prophesied by Elijah and commanded by Elisha and commanded by Yahweh himself. Jehu killed Joram, who was the king of Israel. He was the grandson of Ahab. He killed Ahaziah, the king of Judah. Now, this all happened around the valley of Jezreel. He killed Ahaziah, the king of Judah. He killed 42 of Ahaziah's relatives and several functionaries of the Baal cult. If you remember, he went on, he went in and he brought the prophets of Baal and killed all of them. So though execution of Baal's servants was certainly in accord with Yahweh's will, Jehu's attack went a little bit too far. Despite the fact that Ahaziah's assassination, and remember he's the king of the south, could be attributed to God's providence, it demonstrated an underlying lack of regard for Yahweh's commands. Now remember, this is from the Bible Knowledge Commentary. And it goes on and says this disregard subsequently came to surface in other ways. So Hosea 1:4 here, where it says, and Yahweh said to him, name him Jezreel, naming the firstborn son, probably refers to the slaughter of Ahaziah and his relatives, because it was a bloody situation. Though their deaths did not actually occur in Jezreel, they were very close. They were associated with the wholesale slaughter at that place. So then in verse 6, he conceived a second time, or she conceived a second time, and we don't know about the other two children, whether they were Hosea's or whether they were someone else's child. It says, on that day I'll break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Then she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. And Yahweh said, name her Lo Ruhamah, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel. And I'll explain that in a minute. But I will have compassion on the house of Judah and deliver them by Yahweh their God. And I'm not sure why he added this about Judah, because Judah's going to get in some pretty serious trouble a little bit later. Now, the fulfillment of this prophecy up here came in about 7052 BC when Shallum assassinated Zechariah. And I apologize, I left part of that out. Jehu was told that he would have 4 members of his family reigning in the northern tribes. And so it ended when Shallum assassinated Zechariah. Let me back up here. See, here's Shallum. Here's Zechariah, lasted about a week, and then Shallum killed him, and then Menahem killed Shallum. I mean, this last group of kings, they were just horrible, just horrible. So this cut off, the death of Shallum cut off Jehu's dynasty. Now, in chapter 1 here, Hosea's 3 children are named Jezreel, which means God sows or God makes fertile. And it was the place of Naboth's vineyard, if you remember. The summer palace of the king was in Jezreel, and he looked out his window and he could see the garden of Naboth. So this is where that happened. The second child was named Laurama, meaning no passion or not pitied. And the third was named Lo-Ami, meaning not my people. Notice the L-O in front of the last 2 children. It puts a negative spin on the word. So where Lo Ruama means no passion, if you take the L-O off, it means to be pitied, to have passion. And Lo-Ami, if you take the L-O off of it, it means my people, where Lo-Ami means not my people. Okay? And Hosea uses these terms a couple of times in chapter 2. But beginning in chapter 2, he drops the negative prefix and has new names for the children. In verse 1, say to your brothers, Ami, and to your sisters, Ruama, not the negative. Now, one of the difficult things that I found in this book is to be constantly on guard to realize that Hosea's marriage to Gomer is simply a metaphor. I say simply, maybe it's not simply, but is a metaphor for God's relationship with Israel. And we need to keep reminding ourselves, or I need to keep reminding myself of this as I read Hosea's word. So, my approach with today's study will be to speak of God and his relationship with Israel, not Hosea's marriage to Gomer, which I don't think is the point of this chapter at all. It's a metaphor. Okay, so in verse 1, it says, say to your brothers, Ami, or you are my people, and to your sisters, Ruhama, or I'll have mercy on you. So, although the language in this section is speaking of Hosea's wife, Gomer, it's metaphorically speaking of Israel. Now, the mother, let's see, in verse 2, contend with your mother. Contend, and remember, Mark mentioned this, has mentioned it a couple of times. Much of the Old Testament scriptures are written in poetic meter, rhymes. Well, not so much rhymes, but poetic meter, like a song, a little bit. And so here in verse 2, Hosea says, contend with your mother. Well, mother is the nation of Israel. And the children, as I understand it, now let's back up. The way I understand verse 2 is contend with Israel, for she's not my wife and I'm not her husband. God says, I don't have anything to do with her. I'm done. Everybody out of the pool. And he let her put away her harlotry from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. So Hosea seems to be telling the children to call for the people of Israel to repent and return to God. Let her put away, contend with your mother, and so on. In chapter 1, God speaks of having no mercy on Israel, Lo Ruama, that they're to be invaded and taken into another land. We studied that last week. But almost immediately, he reverses those comments and says that he'll be merciful to them and they will again be his people. And we'll find this in chapter 2 that Yahweh switches back and forth occasionally, talking about punishing Israel and talking about bringing them back into their land. And one of the things that we all need to realize, and I know you all do, is that when God punishes, it's to teach a lesson. He doesn't punish people just for the sake of punishing. And what he does with Israel is to teach them a lesson. And they learn it ultimately, but it's way down the road before they learn it. God had in his plan all along a way to bring Israel back to him. And, he knew that they would eventually obey him and that they would be his people again. But that wouldn't happen overnight. It would be maybe thousands of years if you look at it from a millennial standpoint. We know it didn't happen when they were in captive in Assyria. So it's down the road from that. So verse 2 begins the poetic section of Hosea, and maybe it's a song, as the structure is similar. Now, many of us, I think, know that a song based on experience, a song's a lot easier to memorize than a verse. I've certainly found that to be true. And as Mark has reminded us, this may be why much of the Old Testament is written in this style, so that they could memorize. A poem may contain many elements that give it its structure. So here we are, and most of chapter 2 is in the form or structure of a poem. Now, although the wording in verse 2 applies partly to Hosea's unfaithful wife, it's primarily speaking of the nation of Israel. Now, the book of Hosea, as we spoke about last week, was written by Hosea later. We've talked about this before, and I'm going to go out on a little limb here. We've talked about how the, the, the books of the Bible were written for the people who were standing there, who were reading them, if the book was written, or was listening to the prophet. I don't think that's the case with Hosea, because Hosea, after or as Assyria was invading and taking Israel captive and up into Assyria, as that was happening, Hosea escaped with his companions, other prophets maybe, to Judah. And so, where typically we would say the books were written to the audience, this one's not, because Israel was already taken to Assyria, or was being taken to Assyria, when Hosea wrote this book. And Hosea was down in the south when he wrote the book. So again, part of this limb, it
I got a
seemed.
question.
Yes,
I
sir.
have a question
Yes,
about that.
sir.
I have a question about that. Hello?
Yeah.
Uh, what the timeline shows that Hosea was was enacting he was in action before they went to the captivity.
True.
But I thought I just heard you say that he that this prophecy and whatever was done afterwards.
Okay, I misspoke. The book was written later when he was in the South, but his prophecies, as you just correctly stated, were happening while he was in the North. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah,
Okay. So what I hear you saying is that however this was spoken and enacted, that the people that were there in the north heard what he was saying.
yes.
So
But
it's essentially a picture of what's going to happen imminently if you don't change. And of course, we know they didn't change. So
yeah, and Amos told him that. Hosea told him that. But the Israelites are pretty hard headed. Everything was great and wonderful, particularly during Jeroboam the second's reign. He was a very powerful king. Israel was, what am I looking for? Blessed. And I don't know if they were blessed by God or if God just got out of the way. But during Jeroboam's time, Israel was a great nation. Now it went downhill really fast right after that. But thank you, Mark. You're exactly right. The words of Hosea were spoken to the Israelites while they were there and while he was there. The book, though, was written later on. I'm not sure what difference that makes, but that's the way it was, as I understand it. So in verse 2, let me go back down here. In verse 2, Hosea says, she is not his wife and he is not her husband, speaking specifically about God. Israel's not his people and he is not their God. That's all this is saying right there. And that, for she is not my wife, and I'm, like I say, I don't want to get into the marriage of Hosea and Gomer, and I may be chastised for that, but it's metaphor. So it's God speaking about Israel. The mother is the nation of Israel, as I see it, and the children are the people, the Israelites. And they're being urged to call for their nation to return to faithful living before God. Let her put away her harlotry. Israel needs to put away her adultery by worshiping other gods, the Baals, particularly the Baals, uh, and her adultery from between her her breasts. And I think one of the commentaries that I read, or maybe two or three of them, talked about what that means, that the gifts that Israel gave, that her adultery from between her breasts were the gifts that they gave to these other nations, for partnerships, for helping with wars, and so forth. So after 200 years ish, God has disowned Israel. And it's symbolically shown in the name of his daughter, Lo Ami. You are not my people. The wording about her breast might be a metaphor, I think I already said that, of how Israel had laid bare her bosom to entice her lovers, the nations around Israel, who were being asked to help her at times. Okay, verse 3 goes on and says, or if, okay, if they don't put away her adultery against God, or I will strip her naked. I'll expose her as on the day when she was born, talking about Israel. I will also make her like a wilderness, make her like desert land, and slay her with thirst. If Israel doesn't change, God will take away everything that he's given her, and she will be as naked as a baby at birth. In other words, she'll be like the nation of Israel was the day, or the day before, they came out of Egypt. Israel would be stripped clean of trees, make her like desert land. They're fruit trees, they're grapevines, and so on. And they would have no rain. I think that's what this means when it says, slay her with thirst. Because as you all know, we can't live without water, but for what, 2 or 3 days? You can live without food for like a month, they say, I think, but you can't live without water. Okay, verse 4 says, also, I will have no compassion on her children. And these are not the leaders, but these are the people of Israel, because they are the children of harlotry. Their leaders were forcing or allowing the worship of the Baals in those temples, and the people went right along with it. Oh, isn't it fun to go in the temple? And he says, I'll have no compassion on Israel, or Israel being the nation as a whole, or as from her individual citizens. Now, verse 4 seems to be speaking again of the citizens of Israel who have taken advantage of the poor. Remember back in, I can't remember if it was the last chapter, but it seems like it was Amos that spent so much time talking about how the rich abused the poor. I think that was Amos, wasn't it? Um, I don't think it was chapter 1, but anyway, in order to make themselves rich. Verse 5. For their mother, and who is that? That's the nation of Israel, has played the harlot. She who conceived them has acted shamefully. The generations of Israelites, she who conceived them. Israel conceived generations of citizens, and they've acted just as shamefully as the leaders. For she said, I will go after my lovers. Why? Because they give me bread and my water, my wool and my flax. Mark and Jill understand what that means. My oil and my drink. Not God. They're not getting this stuff from God. They're getting it from, whoever, whatever nations, around them that they were making deals with. So the mother Israel has committed adultery against God, the true God, by going after other gods. And her children have gone after false gods of the surrounding nations. And the leaders of Israel will go after my lovers, as it says here. And the nations Israel had turned to for trade agreements were the ones she went to instead of turning to God, which makes no sense. But then, as I was going through this morning, and I was like, these people are so stupid, and I'm like, I probably would have done the same thing if I'd have been there. I'm not going to say, well, I wouldn't have done that. I found out a long time ago. Don't test God. Don't say, God, well, I wouldn't do what such and such did or so and so did. Okay. Verse 6. Therefore, behold, I will hedge up her way with thorns, and I will build a wall against her. Now, her, again, is the nation of Israel. I will build a wall against her so that she cannot find her paths. I think maybe God's, or God through Hosea here is speaking of armies that she's gone to in the past, but now the armies are turning against her because she can't give the other nations the things that she could have given in the past. Last week we talked about the Syrians who surrounded Samaria. Remember, it was horrible. They were talking about eating donkey heads and using pigeon poop for salt or whatever. It just unbelievable the things that were happening to Israel that were their own fault. They turned to the wrong source. Verse 7. She will pursue her lovers, but she won't overtake them. And she, remember again, is Israel. She will seek them, but won't find them. And then I found this to be a very interesting sentence. Then she will say, I will go back to my first husband. We'll come back to that in a minute. For it was better for me then than now. For Israel does not know that it was I who gave her the grain, who gave her the new wine, who gave her the oil, and who lavished on her silver and gold. And what did they do with it? They gave it to Baal. They gave it to the temples where they went in and worshiped these pagan gods. So Israel no longer recognized God, Yahweh, as the source of their benefits. And Israel will continue to make agreements with these other nations. She will pursue her lovers, but they will be hidden from her. She will not overtake them because they're not her partners anymore. She's not giving them stuff. Now, here, Israel may be getting the point. And I think Hosea is writing about something that's going to happen down the road. Because when she got taken into captivity, Israel didn't say, I'll go back to God, for it was better for me then than now. This is, in my opinion, got to be down the road, maybe 1,000, 2,000, 6,000 years down the road. Verse 8, for she does not know that it was I who gave her the grain. Israel has forgotten. And it didn't take her long to forget. Now, here we are in a nation, and I don't want to go out and say, we were a Christian nation, but I will say this was a lot better nation 200 years ago than it is now. And Israel is about 200 years down the road from the split, or from David, I suppose. And so somewhere down the road, Israel is going to get the point that they are to depend on the true God rather than the false gods, Baal and Astaroth. But in verse 9, he says, therefore, I will take back my grain at harvest time and my new wine in its season. I will also take away I guess I put that in here twice. No, I didn't. I will also take away my wool and my flax given to cover her nakedness. So, why has this all happened to Israel? Well, it's because she's broken the covenant relationship that her ancestors agreed to at Mount Sinai. And that agreement was to go forever. It wasn't supposed to go for 2,000 years or whatever, however long between Mount Sinai and where we are now. It was to go forever. So what I've done is I've pulled out some of the things that Israel agreed to back at Mount Sinai, because it has a bearing on what we're talking about today and why these things are happening to Israel. Deuteronomy 4. God said, well, I don't know if this is Moses talking or God, but anyway, now therefore hearken, O Israel, to the statutes and the judgments which I teach, for to do them. Why? That you may live and go in and possess the land which Yahweh Elohim of your fathers gives you. You shall not add to the word which I commanded you, neither shall you diminish anything from it, that you may keep the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim which I command you. Do you think they did that? Yeah, he did it for a couple of weeks. Now, I'm being a little facetious. They did it for a while. But it says, I declared to you his covenant, which he commanded. This is Moses talking. He declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, even 10 commandments. And he wrote them on 2 tables of stone. And then he says, I'm going to bless you. It shall come to pass if you'll listen to me and you'll do what I'm telling you at Mount Sinai, if you'll do these judgments and keep them and do them, this covenant, that Yahweh your Elohim shall keep to you the covenant and the mercy which he swore to your fathers. And he will love you and bless you and multiply you. He will also bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of the land and your corn and your wine. All of these blessings are going to come to this nation of Israel through this covenant, this agreement that they have made with Yahweh. And verse 14, you'll be blessed above all people, and there won't be male or female barren among you or among your cattle. Be plenty of children born and plenty of animals born. And so he goes on in verse 28. Now, if you diligently obey Yahweh your Elohim, being careful to do all his commandments, which I command you today, Yahweh your Elohim will set you high above all the nations of the earth. You know, I think one of the things that Israel didn't do, which was at least as bad, maybe even worse than not obeying God and not keeping his commandments, was not doing their job to teach the world about Yahweh, to teach the world about his commandments, to teach the world about his statutes. That's why God called this nation. That was their job. They didn't do it. And I think that's as serious a crime as not obeying God. That's just my,
Skip.
yeah, Barb.
Yeah, I kind of take this like a marriage vow that God is making all these promises to take care of Israel or his wife. This is just the start of that marriage vow.
Yeah, marriage
That's all.
is a, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, that's all. That's all I got to say.
Marriage is a covenant. God made a covenant with Israel, and yes, it's similar. I know a lot of people believe God married Israel. I don't know whether he did or not. What I do know is that he made a covenant with them, and it was a two-part covenant. I will do this if you will do that, or if you will do this, I will do that. And he says in verse 2, these blessings are going to be so great, they're going to overtake you. You remember one place it said that, you know, you won't have time to get this year's crop because you're still picking last year's crop. Verse 28, now here comes what happens if you don't. Yahweh will establish you as a holy people to himself, as he swore to you, if you will keep the commandments and walk in his ways. And here's what I was talking about. This is what I think was so important that Israel didn't do. So all the peoples of the earth will see that you're called by the name of Yahweh, and they will be afraid of you. If Israel had obeyed God, they would be blessed above all nations that have ever been on this earth, and people would pay attention. So now, Yahweh will make you the head and not the tail. And you'll only be above and you'll not be underneath if you listen to the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, which I charge you today to observe him carefully. Sorry, I jumped ahead of myself a while ago. And if you don't turn aside from this covenant, from any of the words which I command you today, don't turn over to the right or to the left to go after other gods to serve them. But if you do, it shall come about, if you do not obey Yahweh your Elohim to observe, to do all his commandments and his statutes with which I charge you today. Get ready, folks. Here's what's going to happen. All of these curses will come on you. Well, what curses? It shall come about that as Yahweh delighted over you to prosper you and multiply you, uh, so will he delight over you to make you perish and destroy you. And you will be torn from the land where you're entering to possess it. This is the land that Israel was in when Assyria came and took them out of it. This was the land that Israel was in when the Babylonians came and took Judah out of it. In verse 64, moreover, Yahweh will scatter you among all people, from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth, and there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone, which you or your fathers have not known. He scattered Israel all over the earth. Verse 65, among those nations you shall find no rest, and there will be no resting place for the sole of your foot. But
Hey,
there,
Skip.
yeah,
Hey,
Mark.
Skip.
Yep.
So it's interesting that um, and he says here in verse 64, verse 64, that Yahweh will scatter you among all the people from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone, which your fathers had known. So this, I think, relates very closely to Deuteronomy 32, and that's the section in chapter 32, and starting in verse 7. Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, he'll show you. Your elders, they will tell you. When the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, and he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the uh, proper translation should be the children of God, that meaning other Elohim. He set the boundaries. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the place of his inheritance. So the point I'm making is that they were cast out of that place and came underneath the rulership of those nations that had been separated way, way back, and were under the tutelage and charge of the other Elohim who did not do the right thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. I didn't connect. I wouldn't have connected that. Um, so it was set up from the very beginning that
That
this is happening.
Yeah, we're talking about Genesis 11, where right after the Tower of Babel, where they came and said, we're going to do God on our terms. We're going to seek him on our terms. We're going to make him come down the way we want to with this great big tower. And he said, I've had it. You're out of here. You're cast off. And, then he called Abraham. And here in Deuteronomy 32, Moses says pretty plainly he separated the sons of Adam and set boundaries for the people. Now, here in Deuteronomy 28, you just read, they were going to be cast out and they were going to serve other gods because the other gods were in charge of some of these other lands. Really interesting the way it ties together.
It really is, and it makes a point in that it brings us back to Dr. Heiser's book.
Yeah.
That so God divided the lands, and those lands have their own Elohims.
Right. Exactly.
Interesting. I wouldn't put that together. Thank you. Okay, so he did what he said he was going to do. He separated the early guys, particularly after the Tower of Babel, as you said, and now he's going to scatter Israel to those places. That was awesome. Thank you. And verse 65 says, among those nations you shall find no rest, and there will be no resting place for the sole of your foot, but there Yahweh will give you a trembling heart, failing of eyes, and despair of soul. You're not going to be happy. You're going to be fearful. You've got these other Elohim that are running the show, basically. So interesting. Okay, thank you. All right, now back to chapter 2. In verse 10, it says, "And then I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and no one will rescue her." Maybe I should go back to verse 9, because verse 9 says, "Therefore I will take back my grain at harvest time, my new wine." I'm going to take away all the blessings. And he says in verse 10, "Then I'm going to uncover her lewdness in the sight of her love." Everybody's going to know that something's happened to these people. They are no longer the big dog on the street. And now, whether these other nations knew why, I doubt. But it says, "I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and no one will rescue her out of my hand." With God withholding Israel's blessings of rain, crops, food, and so on, none of the nations around her were interested in coming to Israel's aid anymore. No one will rescue her out of my hand. God's got his hand on Israel at this point, and they are captives, if you will. Verse 11. And this is the one that really gets me, the way some people look at it. "I will also put an end to all her gaiety, her feasts, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her festal assemblies." Now, traditional Christianity looks at this and says that this is speaking of and doing away, or making uh, inroads to doing away with the holy days. Well, wait a minute. It says her feasts, her new moons, her Sabbaths, her festal assemblies. And I looked that up, and I looked at it in 12 different translations, and every single one of them said her. These are the feasts, new moons, Sabbaths, and other assemblies of a pagan Israel. They're not the holy days as we know them. Now, we know that Jeroboam the first changed the dates of the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, that's the only one that we have absolute proof about. But here he's talking about her new moons, her feasts, and so on. Now, a new moon is used to determine the beginning of the month. And this is one of the things that makes it kind of difficult for us when we first come into understanding about observing the holy days. We've got two different calendars. Like, oh, no, wait a minute. Hang on just a second. I can't get this straight. Well, a new moon starts and believe me, there's 50 different ways that people look at new moons. I'm just speaking in a generality. But a new moon starts the month in God's calendar, so that we will know when holy days are, and so on. And one of the holy days is actually on a new moon. That's Feast of Trumpets. But God doesn't call the holy days her or your. He says, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, Yahweh's appointed times, which you shall proclaim as holy convocations, my appointed times are these." That's not what Hosea is saying here. Now, I'm not trying to make a case that they changed the Sabbath and all the holy day. The only one I can tell you they changed is Feast of Tabernacles. So it's possible that, with the exception of the Feast of Tabernacles, they are the same days that we see in Leviticus 23. But if they are, they have been so corrupted by worshiping them, observing them in pagan temples, worshiping Baal and Astaroth on the days of God's holy days, and then adding other types of worship so that they get to the point where they're not God's holy days any longer. Now, the other thing is maybe they did change those dates, but we don't know that. Okay, so Hosea continues in verse 12. He says, I'll destroy her vines and fig trees, of which she said, these are my wages, which my lovers have given me, and I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field will devour them. The vines which produce grapes and other fruits, fig trees, will be destroyed because the Israelites have come to believe they come from other gods. We did this, you know, Baal gave us these grapevines, or they came from other nations over the years. And he says that the beasts of the field will devour them. Well, when Israel is taken away, the land will go fallow, I think is the term, and animals will roam wild and consume every edible plant in the land. And I think that's what he's talking about. And he said, these are my wages. I deserve this. These are the things that other nations have given me because I have given them things. Verse 13, I will punish Israel for the days of the Baals, when she used to offer sacrifices to them and adorn herself with her earrings and jewelry and follow her lovers, so that she forgot me, declares Yahweh. The days of the Baals is an interesting term. Those began early on. Jeroboam put the golden calves in the north and in the south, but the nation really started following Baals when Ahab married Jezebel. Not that they hadn't done it before, but I mean, it really got big when that happened. She brought the worship of the Baals of Phoenicia into Israel. Now, verse 13 here speaks of adorning herself with earrings and jewelry. And while, yes, they did it at Mount Sinai, but we don't know that they did it all of those years. But this is something that Jezebel brought with her, made it worse. And the result of allowing the worship of the Baals, or the days of the Baals, was that Israel forgot the true God, just totally forgot God, who had given them all of the many blessings that they had. She forgot from where her blessings came from. She forgot where her protection came from. And I'm sorry to say it, but it's sort of like what's happened in this country over the past half century. God has been kicked out of this nation. God was kicked out of Israel. Now, verses 14 through 23, Hosea makes a little change, or God instructs Hosea. Look, I want you to, let's lighten up a little bit here. And verses 14 through 23 lead us to a peaceful time on the earth. And, just logic says that it's a long time out in the future from Hosea's time, even past our time, because we hadn't seen it yet. We hadn't seen this. I will allure her. I'll bring her into the wilderness and speak kindly to her. We didn't see that happen with Israel. Maybe with Judah, but we're talking about Israel here. God doesn't punish for the sake of punishment. He punishes so people will learn what they've done wrong. He says he will entice or allure Israel and bring her into the wilderness and speak kindly to her. Israel alone, with no outside influences, and he will teach her his ways, the ways that she has forgotten. Now, that's somewhere down the road. We don't know when. This could be talking about the millennium. It could be talking about, just after the, whatever. We don't know, but it's down the road. Verse 15. Then I'll give her vineyards. Now, where are they? They're out in the wilderness. But he's going to give her vineyards. They're going to grow. They're going to go grapes and other fruits. And the valley of Achor, I'll come to that in a minute, come back to it. The valley of Achor as a door of hope. And she will sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up out of the land of Egypt. There was a time when Israel came out of Egypt that she realized, wow, this is great. It didn't last long, but it did happen. So, what's this valley of Achor? Do y'all remember Achan? Yeah. Okay, I thought somebody was saying. Do you remember when Achan violated the ban of bringing gold and valuables into his tent during the capture of Jericho? He and his entire family were stoned to death in what became known as the Valley of Achor. That's what this is talking about. This at one time was a place that was not a door of hope. It was a door of death. It was a valley of death. But it'll become a door of hope where Israel will enter her land again, and it will be a happy time, similar to when Israel came into the promised land when she returned from Egypt. That's another time that Israel celebrated when they first crossed the Jordan River. This was partially fulfilled, I suppose, when Judah returned to their land from the Babylonian exile. They celebrated, but at a future time, there will be a much greater celebration when the whole nation enters their land when Christ is their king. And I can't help but think of the millennium when I think of this. Maybe maybe not. Verse 16, but it'll come about in that day. What day? The day when this happens. The day when Israel is brought back into their land. The day when there's great celebrations. That you will call me Ishi, and you will no longer call me Bali. Notice Baal is in that word. For I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, from Israel's mouth, so that they will be mentioned never again. Ishi is sometimes translated husband, which leads people to, talk about the marriage. But this is not referring to marriage. It means, actually, in this translation, in context, it means man or mighty man, that you will call me the mighty man, the mighty God. On the other hand, God is so fed up with the worship of the Baals. Here he says, I will no longer be called master or Baal. If you remember, Baal means Lord, or that's one of the translations. And God has been called Baal or Lord for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But he says that's not happening anymore. They will be mentioned by their names no more. The different Baals, because there were different, several of them. Verse 18. In that day, which day? The day's bringing them back. I will also make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, with the birds of the sky, with the creeping things of the ground. And I will abolish the bow, the sword, and war from the land. And I will make them lie down in safety. I think we've looked at this and some other scriptures, which I'm going to read of as the millennium, and I can't disagree with that. There may be, there are obviously other opinions, but at that time, whenever it is, much later, it may be referring to the millennium, but it sounds like the nature of wild animals will be changed. Also, there will be no more war with other nations now, except for the one, at the end of the millennium, if in the beginning. But we find this wording here in Isaiah 11:6-8. The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid. I mean, this seems to be showing that the nature of animals is going to go back to the way it was before the flood. And the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and the cow and the bear will feed, and so on. And the suckling child shall play on the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the cockatrice den. These are not things that you would want to do with animals as they are now. Isaiah chapter 2. He shall judge among the nations. Now, I don't see any way that that's not, it's Yahweh, he shall judge among the nations and shall rebuke many people. And what are they going to do? They're not going to fight anymore. Here's a metaphor. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Now, make sure I'm on the right page. Yeah, I am. Okay. So the last verses of chapter 2 speak of the time that Israel will become the nation God always intended her to be. They will be his people, and he will be their God. And I think all of this goes together. It's pretty plain. So I'm just going to read this, and then I'm done. You all can jump in. But he says, I will betroth you to me forever. Speaking of Israel. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice and loving kindness and compassion. And I will betroth you to me in faithfulness. Then you will know Yahweh. You will know me. It will come about in that day that I will respond, declares Yahweh. I will respond to the heavens, and they will respond to the earth, and the earth will respond to the grain and the new wine and to the oil. And they will respond to Jezreel. Remember, Jezreel was the name of the first son, and Jezreel means to sow, to plant. They will respond to Jezreel. And then verse 23, he goes on and says, I will sow her for myself in the land. Israel will be sown for myself. She will grow. She will be planted, if you will, and grow like crops. I will sow her for myself in the land. And I will also have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion. And then I will say, and this is the name of the second child. I can't, I've gone blank. Anyway, and I will say to those who were not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my Elohim. So that's chapter 2. I hope it made a little bit of sense. Comments?
That's a great poem. It brings it all about way back to the, to the start. Even back to chapter 1, when the names of the children were promulgated. It's kind of a circle and a story that you'd find in a poetic work.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The Lo Ami and the Ami, it brings it, like you said, it brings it full circle. And I can't remember. Let's go back here. When he first starts, okay, he named her not my people, and then at the end, like you said, he's using it without the negative uh, prefix, I suppose you'd say. This was a fun chapter. I worked on it about all week. I really needed some help because I didn't want to go into the Gomer uh, Hosea thing. I hope that was okay because to me it doesn't really have anything to do with Hosea and Gomer. It has to do with Yahweh and Israel. So
Let's skip.
Yeah, Barb.
Yeah. In the start of this, chapter 1, I couldn't understand why God would pick something like prostitution and all that, but it makes it so personal that you feel God's emotion, his uh, his feelings of betrayal, for one thing.
Yeah.
And it just gives a feeling that if it wasn't put in these terms, I wouldn't have it in my heart how God feels about Israel. It just makes it so personal. You feel all the emotion that God feels. That's all.
Yeah, that's a good point. All of the blessings that he gave to the nation of Israel over thousands of years, let's go back to Abraham. Um, and then they stabbed him in the back. And I hope you all are like me. I'm not going to say I wouldn't have done it. That's okay. All right. Any other comments?
I'll
was
mention
thinking,
something else. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
oh, it's Susan. I was just going to tag on. Our first thing that came to mind when she was describing, feeling what God was feeling, was thinking about the story of Abraham and Isaac in the scriptures, and realizing that from that we can feel the Father's agony over sacrificing Jesus. Just kind of lined up in there. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're right. Mark?
Well, to tie in with that, Paul uses this concept of my people who were not my people, etc., along with a lot of other illustrations in the book of Romans about, talking about, this concept, both from the Gentile or from the nation's point of view, as well as the future opening up of the heart of his people, of Judah. And so it's quite extensive. You can find this whole theme in the book of Romans, or the letter of Romans. So specifically, he quotes Hosea in Romans chapter 9, verse 25, 20, and 26. But he also, as we look back to Deuteronomy, he also quotes other places. He quotes places in other parts of the books of the law and history, and he quotes Isaiah. A lot of places that could be where the lesson is brought forward. So that's something to maybe take some time and read through.
Yeah, you mentioned the nations. Of course, we know that's Gentiles. Israel was supposed to teach the nations about God and didn't. As you know, I mentioned that a little earlier. That to me, that's one of the biggest failures of the nation, and maybe we should learn a little bit from that. It's our job too to teach others about God. So, okay, I had asked Rod to put it in the chat. I presume he did. Anna is Rod's daughter's name. I assume. Well, I've just got that. I'll get that to Michael.
So something else that you just brought up to my mind, and I'm glad we had Anna's name mentioned, but one thought following on your thought about our job. And I think a lot of times we think that we have to say something. And, how do you do that? People in our society tend to reject words, especially. Well, I'm just making a gross generalization about that. People don't know how to. A lot of times, don't know how to speak and explain things from a large book like the Bible. But their lives speak. Our lives, just as it. We talked about in Deuteronomy the lives of the Israelites and how they interacted with everyone and the nations. That God set up this nation to be an example. That nation wasn't going to go out and give revival messages to the nations around them. Their lives would speak. And that is elaborated in the first part of Deuteronomy, where, God said, I think it's chapter 7, maybe, I'm not sure, but where he said, the nations around you will look at you and say, what God is this that has such a nation that, what people are having such a great God is this with things that are so just, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so just the point that our lives should be the message that speaks out to other people.
Yeah, who was it that said we should preach the gospel at all times and when necessary use words? Or if necessary, use words. I've always thought that was great. That goes along with what you just said. It is our lives that is supposed to be the message. All right. Other comments? All right. Michael is going to see Brian Smith today and is going to talk to him about that date of March the 18th, because Michael's not going to be here. And of course, he would like to be here. And we'll try to make this on a Sabbath when everybody can be here. So Michael's going to talk to him and get some different dates, but I'm going to bet that it goes much later, because Passover is in about 3 weeks. I'm telling you, it just really runs up on you. Diane and I've started eating crackers and all of the things that normally it slips up on us and we have to throw away or give away a bunch of food. We're going to try to eat all of it this year. So anyway, don't
Well,
forget.
the 18th, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
the 18th is next week.
I know, and I don't think we will do that next week.
Okay, all right.
I mean, I don't know what Michael and Brian are gonna, come up with. Hopefully, they'll come up with 2 or 3 weeks. But just plan on next week, Hosea chapter 3, and
Yep.
yep.
I was gonna say, I'm about ready to pull in the church here. I'll mention it, ask him if it's okay to do it another time, and we'll see what he has. He may have to get back with us on picking a Sabbath, but we'll leave that up to him. Let him choose if that's okay by you.
Yes, and please tell him not next week. So he
Yeah,
can,
I'll let him.
yeah.
Yeah, I'll
Well,
let him know that. Yeah, I got two baptisms next week, so
yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
and we got to do it early, so I'll be missing them.
Well, and then Passover and the days of unleavened bread are like the 4th through the 11th or something like that. I don't have a calendar in front of me, but we don't want to do it in that period.
Lightning has
So,
been detected
uh-oh,
nearby.
we have lightning. So anyway, no biggie. We'll work it out, and I think not that anybody cares, but here's my plan for.
Finishing up a church service here, Clint. Oh, it's here, Skip. Say hi to Clint and Ison, Skip.
Hey, yeah.
All right, we'll let you go, man.
Okay, see you, Michael. Diane and I are going to go to Little Rock. That's at least the initial plan on the day after Passover. In other words, we'll do Passover online for anyone who can't get to a group. And that's on the 4th. And then on the daylight portion of Passover the next day, we're going to drive to Little Rock and we're going to worship with them on the night to be observed, or whatever the correct term of that night is, and have a meal, and then stay for church the next day. Win Skelton's going to be in Little Rock for the first holy day, and then we'll come back here and we'll have church online on the last holy day. So that's my plan right now. Okay. Any other thoughts, comments, corrections, chastisements? Okay. Well, thanks for. Yes. What?
Thank you very much, Skip. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for hanging in. I always wonder, we start off with 16 or 17 people, and I always wonder why it doesn't dwindle down to 3 by the time I'm through. So thank you for hanging in there. So okay, that's it for me. Any other thoughts, comments, etc.? Okay, let's see. Oh, one thing in prayer requests, I think Jill had a reaction to some ibuprofen or something last night and had a pretty rough night. So let's remember Jill in our prayers. So let's see. Well, Mark, would you close us out?
Sure. Father in heaven, thank you so much for our lives. Thank you for the things that we learn in these studies and the interaction with each other. I just pray that you would live in us so that your truth is a reality in the way that we act and think. Thank you very much for the day of ceasing, the day of rest. And we pray that we would honor you because you're the great King. And we ask for your blessing in our lives, your healing on those that were mentioned and those that weren't mentioned. We ask for your mercy and comfort and encouragement. We pray for these things, Father, and ask all of it. Thank you for the preparations Skip's gone through, and we just pray for all these things, Father, in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks. Okay. We hopefully will see you all next week. And I'm going to down